Okay, so I'm very excited to be here in this conference in honor of Guillermo Calvo. And we've discussed, of course, his famous 78 paper, his ultra-famous, ubiquitous 83 paper, but I want to highlight the 88 paper. And sort of Guillermo's big influence on all of us that have been working on emerging markets, debt crises, and sovereign default. And this session is going to be related to that. We're going to have Giancarlo Corsetti, who has had major contributions studying sovereign debt crises and also monetary policy. The two topics very close to Guillermo's heart. And also Javier Bianchi, who has been also studied sovereign debt and emerging markets, and also the management of capital flows. So without further ado, please, Giancarlo, 35 minutes, and the discussant will have 15 minutes.
So thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited and honored to be here. And I think I started to talk to Guillermo 12 years ago when I became obsessed with his paper, which, again, was missing in the discussion. In the beautiful introduction by Mike Buford, I think it definitely belongs there, this 88 paper, which is bravely telling us one very bad consequence of discretionary monetary policy, which is the fact that expectation can drive the outcome, and can drive the outcome in ways that we do not like. And there is very little that the discretionary government can do to harness them. So let me remind you that the paper has two parts. One, real, outright default. The other one, nominal, debasement of debt, both showing that self-fulfilling expectation can create the premise for the government to choose outright default, or the central bank to be forced to monetize the debt. One thing that I like about Guillermo's work on this particular paper is that it's uncompromising on credibility and discretion, meaning that many papers we write, there is always a backdoor sneaking in, what I call commitment à la carte. So there's always some commitment that makes things square, but it's really logically inconsistent with the rest of the paper. And I think one of the true contributions of Guillermo is to show that once you think about discretion, you have to think about discretion to the end. You cannot sneak in commitment here and there just to fix the model. I'm not going to talk about this today, but I ran into Guillermo Calvo actually out of a policy question, which is the OMTs by the European Central Bank. So we need a theory to understand why a program like the OMTs would work. And we look at the dollar, the ECB. We created a model merging the two sides of Calvo model, which is the outright and the inflation debasement together. And that was actually extremely interesting because, number one, he created this premise to look into monetary and fiscal interaction and think that, for many countries, actually, debt and inflation are linked in ways that require institutional development, requires thinking. The second part, which is important, it makes us even more aware of the problem of going into high inflation equilibria driven by fiscal imbalances, which is you don't control expectations anymore. You have indeterminacy. You have lots of equilibria there. So it's not simply, fiscal dominance, we monetize the debt, what a bad thing. Worse, we lose control. We lose control there. And it's very clear in Calvo, and we repeated, we look at a couple of, so the idea that you can transfer self-fulfilling equilibrium from debt to money, there is this issue, which has to do with, again, losing control of expectation. Then, since I didn't have enough, I really wanted to rewrite Guillermo's paper completely opening up all the corner that he didn't look at because the model is an idea and is a benchmark and is a two-period model. So with Fred Mang, we spent some time rewriting it completely. And we discovered a very interesting connection between this slow-moving crisis like Ivan and Guido Lorenzoni, and fast crisis like Ancora and Kio, and that is the title of the paper. But today I'm not going to do that. Today I'm going to do something very simple, which is almost a little narrative. The model is almost a description, very simple. There is no choice theoretic aspect to it, which is instead there. But it's something that, again, it may be worth thinking about it. So what I'm going to do in the slides and the paper is to look at the Calvo model in the reverse mirror. So he starts with the real outright default, and then he goes into the basement. I go the other way around. We start with the basement, we go into the outright. And in the conversation with Guillermo, I understood that the paper was actually initially motivated as a monetary paper, the basement paper motivated by the fiscal inflation. Maybe I misunderstood you, but you told me that it was about the fiscal inflation in Brazil. And then for many reasons linked to the editorial process, people told him, why don't you do real first? Because we are macroeconomists, we like a real part. At the time, it was the mantra of the day. So the self-fulfilling outright comes first, the monetary comes second. I do the other way around. And then I actually would like to make you think about the link between this self-fulfilling equilibrium of Calvo in 83 with all the literature more familiar to me as an open economy macro, which has to do with the currency crisis. So Krugman, Maury Obstfeld, and all the people working on the area. Actually, this paper was written in honor of Maury, showing that what he did actually had Calvo in the background. Now I can actually turn it around, presenting the same paper, two papers for one. But there is a difference. There is a difference that if you look at Krugman, he talks about that, but there is no that in the model. So this is an important thing. With Guillermo, fiscal policy is actually explicitly modeled, and that is important. So to make the talk a little bit more modern, after many conversations with Chris, when we were both at Yale a long time ago, I do this in a FTPL, fiscal theory of the price level framework. So with Eric Leeper, Chris, Mike Woodford, Cochrane in the background, just because it's actually a very nice way to put all these things together. So I hope I convince you about that. So let me tell you the story. It's really a narrative model, okay? There is a bad shock, bad disturbance that create an imbalance. Adjusting to COVID, adjusting to the war now is very socially costly. So there is a chance, we hope, that the economy will bounce back. So it's a bad shock today, but there is a chance that the economy will bounce back, reducing the pain of the adjustment. No? Because the scale of the adjustment, once the economy bounces back, is much lower, or at least diminish the cost. So it's a situation in which you have adjustment now versus deeper adjustment in the future if the economy does not bounce back. So it's a gamble. Okay? We would like a model that formalizes this gamble. Waiting makes sense, may make sense, but there is some value at risk there. It's a trade-off that is not mechanical. And we would like to have a model telling us about the consequences of postponing the adjustment. So what we do, we have a very simple model where there is a government and private agents, which are risk neutral for simplicity. We start with a steady state with a constant price level, and then at time zero, something bad happened. There is a large budget deficit, perhaps a large recession. If no correction takes place, and nothing happened to the price level, the fiscal imbalance will grow over time. Because you start to roll over the debt at a higher interest rate, the positive interest rate, and there is like a growing debt. So at some point, either some kind of fiscal correction occur, there is a boom, there is a new government, whatever you want to, or we need to pay for the deficit that has been accumulating, That can be with high inflation, or it can be with outright default, or both. So we work a model in which the whole point is there is a prospective fiscal correction that may take place in the future with some probability. And if that take place, then macroeconomic price stability can be sustained again. Okay, so there is a deficit. There is this idea of the gamble in the future. If the correction takes place, the gamble succeeds, price stability is maintained. If not, something bad happens, can be outright default or debt debasement. So the idea is basically, should be familiar to you, holding price stability in the near term sort of buys time for a correction to happen. And we sort of suppose in the model that monetary policy will accept the gamble and delay inflation as long as the required correction is not too large, is reasonable. So there is this idea of a gamble, like no inflation today, with the possibility of higher inflation in the future with some probability. And here, GC, notice we share one thing I share with Guillermo Calvo is the initial. So the GC model says that there are many ways in which this gamble is not that straightforward, and actually the outcome depends not only on luck, but also on private agent expectation. Okay? So there could be many ways in which that happen. We just choose one, which is suppose the probability of the correction falls with the size of the required correction. So the longer you wait, the bigger will be the surplus you need, and people start to be very skeptical about that large surplus will be implementable. So basically, we have models in which you can have price stability indefinitely in the future if the correction takes place, or you may fail if maybe agent expected to fail and does not leave space for the central bank to wait, not to buy time. So the model is actually is a three equation, four equation, depending on how you count them, model with four specifications. One is there is no hope for fiscal correction. So delay inflation is a little bit pointless. You can do it, but it's pointless because sooner or later you get the inflation. Second, you introduce a prospective random correction with exogenous probability. In that case, you go into models akin to Krugman 79 currency crisis. There will be a natural collapse. Then you start to say, okay, but there is a two-way feedback between expectation and what happened, and there you open the door, the Pandora box of self-fulfilling equilibrium. Now I show you that the same model, you can do debt debasement, or you could do outright default, which is basically Calvo 1988 in reverse, section 2 and section 1 in a row instead of the outright versus the monetary aspect. And then I'll ask some difficult questions to the audience about today, before you ask me. So about what it means for today's situation. So this is the model. So very simple. We need long-term bond because we need something to the base over time. If you don't like long-term bonds, think that many spending commitment of the government are actually fixed in nominal terms. Actually, my first job in Italy, I got a fixed wage for 3 years where 5-6% inflation were sort of reducing the real wage and the budget and improving the budget constraint of the government state in very, very nicely. So that is the kind of long-term spending commitment that I had in mind, besides long-term bond. There is a price Q for the bond. The usual coupon decaying, so that is more tractable, but I really don't need any of that. The bonds to maturity is just 1 over the price plus this row, the index, the coupon. So you have the flow budget constraint of the government is simply, whatever output minus private consumption minus taxes S, lump sum tax, the net income. Then you have the payment of the income from holding or government bonds, whatever deficit is there will be financed with issuing more bonds. The second budget constraint is the government, simply give you the dynamic of that linked to the tax revenue, PS, all in nominal terms here. It's very important. So this is a very simple model, like, that is now well understood. The book of John Cochrane is making this point very clear, that the real value of debt today, the coming to maturity, outstanding debt today, to the left-hand side, nominal divided by price level, the real value is equal to the present discounted value of the real surpluses. And in an initial steady state in which price is constant, 3 becomes 4, very simple, where there is like a constant price level, a constant surplus, and that is sustained. So here is the game. There is a deficit. What happens if there is no hope for a correction? What happens if there is some hope for a correction with some probability? What happens if there is a hope for a correction with some probability? The probability depends, the way we see the probability depends on the size of adjustment. In particular, the probability of an adjustment goes down the larger the required size of adjustment. Number 1, 2, 3 will be that debasement. Number 4, I just change a variable and I show you that the same model can be interpreted as outright default with a partial, with an haircut less than 100%, which is endogenous to the sustainability of the model. Just to simplify the algebra, we look at a jump in the price level. We could look at inflation. It just complicates a little bit, but it's focusing on one-time jumps in the price level, which I call the inflation crisis, makes the algebra and the narrative a little bit easier. Okay, so what about, remember Krug 179 became very famous with this paper on currency crisis. This is basically Krug 179 with not just talk about fiscal balance, with actually modeling fiscal balance in the model. And so the starting point is that when there is a deficit, delta, the initial steady state valuation of the debt does not work anymore. There is an imbalance there, which means that either you abandon price stability today, you have an immediate inflation depreciation in the case of Krugman, it's the same thing in the model, or if you have it in the future, then something else must happen, which is the price of the bond must fall, looking at the basement in the future. So either you have a P0 jumping today, or you have P0 jumping in the future reflected on the price of the bond, on the yield of the bond, which is equation number 6. So in the jargon of international currency crisis model, it is useful to use the concept of shadow price level, shadow short rate. So the shadow price level is basically what would be the jump in the price if price stability was abandoned in time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. You see the first graph to the left, you see that the shadow price level increases because over time you are rolling over more debt. So given the steady state surplus, you need a larger jump in the price level to reduce the real value of the outstanding debt. The bond yield goes up correspondingly because every time you wait, the size of adjustment increases. The interest rate, the shadow interest rate, is answer the question, suppose I fix the inflation crisis at time 6, what would be the interest rate, the short-term interest rate, one period before? Okay? So you see that the more you wait, the larger the anticipated jump, one period before the interest rate will be higher to be able to maintain one period before price stability for one last period before the inflation crisis kicks in. And the shadow debt as a function of t also goes up. So this is Krugman, except that the model is not closed because nothing tells us when the collapse will happen. It can happen at any moment. At any moment. Krugman, there are many different ways. Actually, my point is that you can map the ways into each other. You can use the lower bound of reserves, upper bound of interest rate. What I'm going to use next is a maximum reasonable adjustment to the surplus. So let me go to the augmented Krugman, if you want, and the prequel to Calvo's successful Harry Potter series of papers on the Calvo, on the tech crisis. So the prequel was to say, suppose that there is the possibility in the future that there could be an adjustment, omega t, that would completely offset the imbalance, so guarantee price stability. Central bank can go to whatever rule they want, the price will not move, because the fiscal side, the background music is now tuning into a good tune for monetary policy. But this omega t is not unbounded. Suppose that there is an upper bound to the amount of surplus that the government can generate, economic, political reasons, we don't work it out. Now remember, omega t, the required adjustment is increasing in fiscal imbalance over time. The more you wait, the larger will be the fiscal correction that you need. So, and so is inflation over time, will be increasing. So when you work this model, you can actually work out a unique equilibrium, like in Krugman. If no fiscal correction occurs, there will be a moment in which price stability will be abandoned. That would be when the required adjustment will be equal to the upper bound. Okay, so this is, sometimes it's called the natural collapse. If no adjustment takes place, there is a capital T, which is the date in which price stability will need to be abandoned if no fiscal correction happens. So you see, remember, you see that the shape of this growing shadow prices, debt, bond, whatever yield. The shape is different because there is this probability of correction here. So you see agent can still anticipate every period that there is a probability of correction, which is constant. But at some point, capital T, unique equilibrium, there will be a collapse. Now, let me show what happened in a collapse doing two cases, contrasting two cases. Case one is no fiscal correction occur. There is an inflation crisis, for sure, at T, capital T equal 12. Now, going to a second scenario, saved by the bell scenario. Just when you think that inflation crisis is there is a correction. There is a boom, there's a new government, whatever you want. So if you compare these two cases, you see that in case one, you will have a jump in the price level. In case two, you will not have the jump in the price level. In both cases, at time 9, the interest rate will shoot up because we don't know whether the fiscal correction will happen at time 10, or we know that there will be the natural collapse at time 10. So you have this equilibrium that it's a lot like depreciation, inflation in open economy, going towards Calvo 88 or Opsfeld 86 from the point of view of depreciation. Okay, so far we have one unique equilibrium. But you see also that the required fiscal correction, which is the graph bottom center, goes up in time as was before. The probability of fiscal correction in this model is still constant. So basically I think I already told you, what I like about this is sort of, as an open macro, I used to struggle telling students, why do you have a devaluation, the kind of early generation model? Now actually it's very clear. You wait to buy time, you may be unlucky, and you have a depreciation there. So it is like reminiscent of Krugman. I call it augmented Krugman. There is a rationale for waiting and keeping the exchange rate fixed and the price level stable. It is definitely a model where the gamble is all played on the random correction. So it depends on luck, whether you keep the price level or you don't. Is this a good model? Clearly, it's a fantastic framework to think, but this is where the narrative becomes very interesting. And this is where I think Guillermo's contribution is very important, which is to say, if you enter this kind of gamble, there are zillions of ways in which the gamble created two-way feedbacks between what you do and private sector expectation. We could have picked many. We picked this simple one that says, as the fiscal correction grows, the probability of a correction that agent attached to it goes down. So we had this probability is no longer constant. So think about an optimistic world, optimistic beliefs. I can wake up in the morning and believe that, the Fed, the ECB will be able to keep price stable for the longest time. At some point, that there will be a correction. So I look at the natural collapse as something coming very far in the future. So there will be intervening period in which things may go better. So what happens is that in that scenario, the bond price will be high. Interest rate will be low. The debt issuance will definitely be slow. But the debt accumulation will be slow. So will be the required correction, which means that you start in a situation where you still believe that the probability of correction will be high. Why? Because after all, the correction is feasible. It does not immediately get out of control. So this is an equilibrium which is self-validating in the sense that the correction may happen or may not. But what is important is that the T, the terminal date of the game, is far. So you have a situation, solving the model you see in the paper, usually we have three equilibria there. One we don't like. Ivan Verni with Guido explained us why we don't like it. It's non-variation, but two of them, they're reasonable. So one equilibrium is T equal 10. And again, I play the game of nothing up, and on the fiscal side, there is an inflation crisis at T10, or there is a saved by the bell scenario, last-minute fiscal correction. So you see that you have a similar behavior than before, except that there is something that I like a lot in this graph, and I'll return to it. If you look at the graph to the right-hand side top, this is the bond yield. Okay, so this is a model where you expect an inflation crisis coming, but since you are so optimistic about the fact that we can do it, there will be time in which something good can happen, the bond yield hardly move. And this is something interesting there, because usually the bond yield immediately would jump. And actually, there's been a big discussion recently about the fact that if there is an inflation coming, how come for the longest time the bond yield did not, the financial market did not anticipate. So, but you see also the engine of the expectation in the bottom row. The middle one is the required fiscal correction. It starts low and then immediately at one point starts to go up very steeply when we get close to the T10 at the moment, the natural collapse. The probability attached to a fiscal correction is very high, and then at some point starts to go down and go down pretty quickly. So turn around and say, okay, Italy is doomed. There is really no time for nothing. We cannot expect. We cannot wait anymore. Spain is doomed, whatever. Argentina is doomed. Your favorite country. So you don't give any space for the policymaker to act. You think that the T is very close. So immediately bond prices become very low, yields very high, the debt and the deficit start to compound very quickly. You start with attaching a probability of correction, attach a probability to the correction that is very low. And again, self-validating expectation, you see it in the data. And this is exactly the same thing. Is actually in this particular numerical example is pretty fast. Now the equilibrium is t equal 2, t equal 10. So I think it's very clear there is nothing profound. I have to confess, I did this for my undergrad in Cambridge, which is a little bit special, so they can take this. But that forced me to be as clear as possible, and they could chew it, which is good. So suppose that God knows a correction will come at time t6. Under optimistic expectation, we'll see it. We'll see price stability at time t6, there will be a correction. If markets do not like that, they get pessimistic beliefs, we'll never get there. There will be immediately a crisis. So what is very useful for this exercise is that thanks to the FTPL, I could actually make you sleep by doing exactly everything, not in terms of debt debasement, but in terms of outright default. Actually, with a change in variable, you can just introduce a new variable, theta, 1 over p. The recovery rate is basically the inverse of the price level. So when there is a jump in the price level, that is correspond to a haircut on the bondholder. And everything I said is exactly the same, which is exactly one of the big contribution, I think, in the 88 paper by Guillermo, which shows you how you map outright default into the basement. The FTPL is a language and a theory in economics that sort of give you a very clear way to think about that. So the model can generate the slow-moving debt crisis a la Lorenzoni-Verni. We already showed you that the debt was increasing. And everything I said, which is not choice theoretic, there is no welfare here, holds. I work it out. Holds in models where you set up an objective function for the government, and you work out the model. Actually, Martin early on has already done that in. Already, recently there's been a debate on the Calvo model with Iris et al. And me and Luca on the also bringing in inflation and fiscal interaction. So, I think this is a great contribution, not this, Guillermo contribution. It's a great contribution to the way we should discipline our thinking about what is going on now. Rephrase this monetary and fiscal interaction in ways that are realistic, look at the data and realize that there is a situation in which, maybe we should discipline our life, even thinking that maybe debt overhang theory and debt default theory, they are not two different things. It's time also to look better into not only the monetary transmission, but also the transmission of this crisis into the real economy. So let me ask you the question before you ask me, what about inflation today in light of this model? And we could have two takes. One takes to take the model very seriously and say, actually, you know what, we already seen this. COVID-19 was the big shock. The inflation today is doing exactly what the model is doing, the debasement that the model says sometimes is necessary to correct without a real fiscal adjustment, okay? So remember, and this goes to the discussion yesterday, you can have a price level adjustment at the basement without persistent inflation. So there is a role to understand how monetary and fiscal interaction work there. It's not that far from the discussion in Europe about the adjustment in real wages, right? You can have a level adjustment without persistent inflation. This is exactly the same thing. So one interpretation would take the model, face value, and say, we already seen it. Another interpretation is that, wake up, the gamble is still on the table. And we have bad shocks. Every shock may have added to B to change the terminal date T. While in the first case, if the gamble was lost in the past, we are lucky because inflation expectation, at least the way we measure, are not unanchored. If the gamble is still going on, we may see more action also on the inflation expectation. I've done it.
Thank you very much. We have.
Okay, so first thank you to the organizers for putting together this superb event, celebrating Guillermo's contributions. Personally, Guillermo has been truly inspirational for me since very early in my career, even going back to my undergraduate in Uruguay. So I'm very grateful to be celebrating this event today with this great audience. So as an overview of the paper, so this is, thank you very well. Okay, so the paper sets up a currency crisis model with long-term nominal debt and incorporates a fiscal correction shock. And it provides examples where there are multiple equilibria, okay, in the exit of the peg. Okay, as Giancarlo was saying, you can have equilibrium where the fixed exchange rate is abandoned in period 2 or period 10. And that's another finding in the paper. I think it's a very nice paper. So I will do in my discussion is first summarize briefly the model, and then provide some comments. One is going to be on multiplicity. I'm going to argue that multiplicity is actually more general than what is right now in the paper. Then I'm going to discuss the question of when to abandon the currency peg in the context of this model. And then finally I will, I guess, answer the question that Giancarlo asked, which kind of he already answered, but I'll have some thoughts on that as well. Okay, so the paper starts from a situation where there is a peg that is sustainable. So given a certain amount of debt level, nominal debt level B0, there's going to be a surplus, a real surplus, that is going to allow the government to run this currency peg at the desired price level, P minus 1. But now suddenly there is a reduction in the real surplus. So now the debt basically is such that this currency peg is no longer sustainable. Okay? You cannot keep P minus 1 because you violate the intertemporal budget constraint. So if you have one period debt, that would be very simple. You abandon immediately. There's really nothing to do. But with long-term debt, you can have basically a delay in the abandonment. Basically, in this equation, there are going to be two variables that can potentially adjust. That's P0 and Q0. That's the bond price at time 0. So, the basic idea is that when you have one period debt, all the debt is roll over every period. But if it's long-term, you only have to roll over a fraction of it. So if there's an anticipation of inflation in the future, that gets reflected in a lower bond price. That's a capital loss for the bondholders, but the government doesn't have to compensate for that. So far this is standard, fiscal theory of the price level with its, insights and its limitations. But then the paper introduces this fiscal correction shock that, as Giancarlo was explaining, this can make the peg sustainable. It can rescue the government and let it keep the price at P minus 1. And this shock follows a Boston process. Once it's realized, then that's the end of the game. You are able to keep your currency peg. But now this shock has a limited support. Okay? At some point, the debt may become so large that, you know, even with the best fiscal shock that you could get, you still violate the intertemporal budget constraint, so you have to abandon. So, you know, in this environment, you can imagine that if you have a higher probability of a fiscal correction, that's going to help delay the abandonment, because now you think about the time zero intertemporal budget constraint. I don't know if you can. There's an expectation there. Okay, so the fact that you might get lucky and get this correction shock, it raises the present value of your surplus, and so this can give you the chance to delay further the exit. The other result is that you know, there are examples in the paper where you get this non-unique timing of abandonment, and to construct this multiple equilibria, Giancarlo was explaining, there's an assumption that the probability of this fiscal shock is assumed to be decreasing in the size of the fiscal correction. Okay, and it's not that it's implausible or anything, but I was thinking about this and playing with the equations, and I was thinking, you know, what about, you know, Calvo 88, okay? So thinking through Calvo 88, you know, I'm going to argue that you can get multiplicity even when you have a constant probability of a fiscal shock. So let me walk you through the argument. So consider an equilibrium where there is an exit at t equals 1. Okay, and the government is really marginally insolvent. Okay, so you are at that level so that you're exactly at this maximum point, and you abandon. And now think about another equilibrium where you abandon one period later, okay, period 2, and conjecture that this leads to a higher bond price. Okay. Now, if you have a higher bond price, that means that there's going to be it's cheaper to borrow, so you get a lower debt in period 1. Okay, you're in period 0, you're running a deficit. Now suddenly the bond price goes up, that makes it cheaper to borrow, so your B1 now is going to be lower, and it's going to satisfy this fiscal constraint. Okay? Now, all we're left basically is to verify that the increase in the bond price is actually consistent with the intertemporal budget constraint. Okay? And the reason why it is consistent, starting from a situation where you're marginally indifferent, is that when you delay the abandoning, now there is a strict increase in the present value of the surplus. Okay? Now, in this right-hand side there, in this expected value of the surplus, the fact that there's a positive probability of a good shock means that the expected value of the surplus goes up. So Q0 actually goes up. Okay? So you can get basically you can get multiple equilibria even with a probability of a fiscal shock that is basically time invariant. Okay? And this is really goes back to the insights of Guillermo's work, where you have these expectations of debasement in the future, or default in the future that raises interest rates, and that basically confirms that the government in the future will end up debasing. And of course, we also know from Guillermo's work that you could, in principle, put a ceiling on the interest rates, and that would basically help you delay. Okay, you can achieve the equilibrium where the delay of the abandonment occurs in a future date. Okay, so let me say that I think this is a very nice model, but I think it's mainly useful to think about as a positive theory. If you think about a normative theory, here there's really no decision by the central bank. And so in a way, I feel it's more about waiting rather than gambling. Okay? The government is just there waiting. It's not taking any action to increase or decrease the risk of the abandonment. But another aspect in the model is that actually at the end, C equals Y. So any paths basically deliver exactly the same level of welfare. Okay, I think it's good in terms of simplicity, but it would be interesting to extend the model to think about optimal policy. So one potential path that could be followed is in the sort of maybe Rebelo and Beg framework, where they have basically a cost of abandoning, and they have also benefits. They also have benefits from abandoning today, because if you abandon, the idea is that if you abandon today, you basically avoid the intertemporal distortions in consumptions. When you have a cash in advance constraint, if you know that you're going to abandon in the future, that's going to cause distortions in the path for consumption. So it might be better just to basically exit at time zero. Okay? And in that paper, they also show that when you have a higher probability of a fiscal redemption, that increases the exit period. Okay? So there's, I think, an interesting contrast in terms of the model. One is about nominal debt through fiscal theory of the price level, and one is about seigniorage. I think it's interesting to contrast these two models. So finally, in terms of the question that Giancarlo was posing in the presentation, so I think the paper, in a way, is a bit suggestive that this inflation post-COVID is part of a gamble. Okay? Now, it's not clear. I don't think Giancarlo takes a stance about whether it's really these fiscal theory arguments that are behind the increase in inflation, but there is some suggestion that it could be. Okay, and of course there is another view about why we had inflation, and Ivan and Shemne have pushed this line that what happened was basically there was a cost push shock coming from demand rebalancing towards goods, together with some supply constraints, and of course some fiscal and monetary stimulus. So, if you think about the coming down of inflation the last 3-4 months, there's really no obvious fiscal shock. So that that makes me think that it has to do more with this conventional view, quote unquote. But I think it's still open up for debate, and I'm looking forward to more work on this area.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi there. Giancarlo, many thanks for the presentation. I will make 2 comments / questions based on 2 sides of my professional experience. First one is related to my past as the former chief economist of Moody's, right? One way for you to perhaps think of an agent which is the private sector, but not really private sector, in the sense that they have no skin in the game, is a rating agents making the change on the expectations on the private sector in a way such that they effectively lead to a default or a strategic default from the part of governments, right? How to model the interaction of these external agents in terms of the crystallization of the expectations of the private sector. The second one is something that I'm sure you'll be sympathizing with, and now is my hat as a European Commission official, is the interaction between the monetary rule and the fiscal rule, piggybacking to my earlier remark. As you know, we have not only fiscal but monetary rules in Europe. The monetary rules in Europe, the Stability and Growth Pact, the SGP, has a particular checkered history, but you could think of a way in which, when this is properly designed and implemented, that this spins the outcome of the model, not only in terms of a policy, but of an optimal policy. You collapse a multiple equilibrium in an equilibrium which is the optimal one. You know that we have suspended the SGP for 3 years. We are going to do this again this year because of the war in Ukraine. We had suspended it for 2 years because of the COVID shock. And we are exactly in the moment in which we are rethinking again the structure of the SGP. So if you think about this strategic game between the monetary rule and the fiscal rule that could be an optimal policy path, how would you think in terms of perhaps implementing this on your model? So, comments, suggestions?
So two comments following up from some of Javier's comments about the generality or the multiplicity of the equilibrium. Maybe it can also relate to some of the contributions that people in this room have made. So on the issue that you might get that exiting right away will be better because of these temporariness effects that he was referring to, Charlie Beck's and Sergio Revelo's work. It also reminded me of the work that Asaf Racine did with Elhanan Hellman, which will push in the opposite direction, because if you, in their context was like you have overlapping generations, so then the time that you have the fixed exchange rate benefits the generations that are living, but hurts the ones that will arrive later. So maybe you want to wait because you don't want to, so it's like an heterogeneity argument. And then also related maybe to the more recent work that Guillermo has been doing about when you start thinking about optimality of when to leave, it's that maybe government bonds play a richer role. This connects also with the comment about in Charlie's work was about transaction cost. But Guillermo has been thinking about liquidity. And then government bonds have a role as a liquidity instrument or convenience yield or whatever name the modern literature wants to give it. Maybe the choice of what is optimal is not as open as just choosing from the random choice of the big T.
Okay, thank you. Where is Javier? Wonderful. Great comment. Maybe we should go waiting for Godot, but no, I still like gambling on price stability and better. But the point is, all welcome comments. I've been working with Luca, especially on also for the EU for this. The problem is, how do you compare different costs there? And the issue is the cost of default. So like in Guillermo's original paper, the cost of inflation is bounded, while now we are used to quadratic costs that are unbounded. And those costs in this model may be very, very strong. So we have actually paradoxical result in the model where budget separation forcing the central bank to monetize discipline the fiscal policy. A little bit what John Taylor was saying today, the opposite. So forcing the central bank to seeing the horrible situation if there is no fiscal correction, the fiscal policy become more. But this is all like a little bit too mechanical, implicit in the way we model cost of default and cost of inflation. So I'm completely sympathetic that we should go more choice theoretic, but I think there is a new generation of model to write with a little bit richer thinking. You know, see Cristina, see recent work also empirical, no? on the transmission of sovereign risk. So, and I think it's still not obvious, as Enrique was saying, that you want to move soon or you want to move later. I conclude, for example, there's a big debate on the desirability of the leveraging. In a Calvo-Keogh model, sorry, in a Collin-Keogh model, you want to deleverage. If you are in the crisis zone, you want to go back to the safe zone. In Guillermo model, you only want to go back when you are close to the threshold. If you're far enough, you don't care. you prefer to gamble. So, and the two models are extremely insightful in different ways, depending on the nature of the crisis. But again, it's another example where waiting or acting immediately depends a little bit on the way you create the model and you attribute numbers to the cost, the welfare theoretic aspect of the decision. I should stop here, right? I can entertain you with another. But this model was a little bit of a fable, no? It's a way to think. It's a narrative, but I found it fun.